Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Trevor Smith-Miller. I'm the Communications Manager for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you to everybody for attending today's webinar, which continues the spring leg of our 2024 series. If you're new to our webinar series, a little background on our group. CCSN works to connect patients, supervisors, and other stakeholder groups with decision makers and the wider community to engage in discussion and to act on evidence-based best practices to alleviate the medical, emotional, financial, and social costs of cancer. To learn more, visit survivornet.ca. Now, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and a link will be provided by the email you registered with, along with a link to the slides provided with this presentation. We will add a quick Q&A session at the end, but don't wait until the end to post your questions. If you'd like, just go to the questions tab on the Go to Webinar menu. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Don Husereau is an adjunct professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa. He does freelance healthcare research and works with private and public sector life sciences organizations to help them understand the value of health technology and its implications for health and innovation policy, a topic that we are going to be covering extensively right now with his webinar, Challenges and Potential Solutions for Improving Health Technology Assessment.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction, and I hope people enjoy the talk. I'm putting together essentially a list of challenges and potential solutions that are my own opinion, but I hope to back them up, and I hope that this is something you might be interested in. Just as a starting point, I am a freelance researcher. I do actually still work with public not-for-profit organizations like CADTH, but I also work quite a bit with life science companies, ostensibly drug companies, often in the cancer space. As my previous experience, I did serve as a health economist on our Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review process. I also served on the Ontario Formulary Committee. I had a long-standing experience with CADTH, and since 2011, I've been doing health policy research with a focus on technology policy, and as I said, often in cancer. So well, I guess I wanted to begin by being maybe thoughtful about a hard decision, and we can use this example out of this newly advertised approach of precision medicine. And we might imagine a new drug, and we'll call it drug X, and it's for a condition called small cell lung cancer. And for those that don't know, this is the kind of lung cancer that has very few treatment options and very poor prognosis, potentially compared to other lung cancers. It's fatal. We haven't seen treatments for years, and now we have a new drug that comes along. And it's expected actually to extend a person's life considerably. So for people who have about 5 years expected life to live, it could give them an extra year of life. I should say this is hypothetical. Now we have a new drug, drug Y, and it's expected to even be better than drug X, except in patients with a genetic mutation. It's not considered to be better, but if you have a genetic mutation, if you have a biomarker, you could actually get an extra year on top of drug X. And the test for this is 90% accurate. That means when we say accuracy, we mean that it'll accurately provide a positive result in 90% of people who have the mutation. But it'll also provide an accurate negative result in 90% of people who don't have. So one other twist, we have 1% of people who have small cell lung cancer actually have this mutation. So there's a lot of technical information here, but that's exactly the point. And this is a question I ask when I'm doing HTA 101. What's the chance a patient with a positive test will benefit if this new drug Y comes in? And typically I give a poll for this. I'm not giving a poll today. But I think a lot of people think that a drug, this drug should probably have a high chance of working, when in fact, what ends up happening is the chance that that a patient would actually benefit with a positive test is less than 10%. And this is sort of one of the challenges with health technology and health technology assessment is it's difficult to interpret. We have to make complex decisions based on a bunch of information. How can that be? How can you have a positive test? And it says here that if you have a genetic mutation, you'll get an extra year of life. You should benefit. So shouldn't it be 90% if you have the positive test? Well, no, and it's because of how tests work. If we have a situation where if you have the mutation, you are only 1% of individuals who may have had that mutation. So if you have a positive result, you are either 9 of 10 individuals who actually have the mutation, or you're 99 of 990 individuals who don't actually have the mutation. So you stand a good chance of not actually having a mutation despite a positive result. Tests are tricky to interpret. And so decisions about new technology are not straightforward. So how do we make decisions then? Well, the first thing is we have to decide what benefits are important. I think for small cell lung cancer, we probably can all get our head around the fact that if something extends our life, or if something prevents us from progressing further, we're probably going to think those are important. But we first have to decide what types of benefits are important. And then we have to look at evidence, typically, because we want proof that if we're taking something versus taking something else, we're going to achieve those benefits. Or maybe we're trying to avoid harms, which is another type of benefit. And so these decisions are complex. They need to think about the goals that people have in mind when they're actually using a new technology. There could be other goals, not just health benefits. There could be things like the ability to access something if we live far away, or getting to a diagnosis more quickly, or the like. There could be multiple benefits. And I'm not a patient with small cell lung cancer, so I don't know that I can chime in about all the things that might be important to me, but I'm sure we can all think about things that have been important to us in our own health journeys. So how do we make the decision? Well, it's an important thing. There's another issue too, which is what about costs? We all know that if we have to bear the price out of pocket, there are people that are going to be able to afford this more so than others. And so we would unfairly be offering a treatment where some people would have access because of their financial means and others wouldn't. So we use insurance to deal with that. But if we have insurance, money is still not infinite. We still have to think about where does the money come from? And this is another issue entirely, which is if we pay too much for things, we have to get that money from somewhere. We could raise taxes, but that's unfair to people who have little money, and we could also borrow from other sectors, which might be unfair to those other sectors. We can't escape the idea that money has to come from somewhere, although insurance is a good first start. We also have to make this decision, and so if you did not guess less than 10%, maybe you're acknowledging the fact that there should be other people at the table who can help interpret complex scientific information. But we also have to make these decisions quickly. And so what do? Well, we could ask individuals. We could just have no process whatsoever. We could go through elaborate approaches to evaluation. And all of these have different trade-offs in terms of being transparent or fair and introducing potential biases. But in the end of the day, we still have to make a decision. And that's what brings us to HTA. So the payers need to make these decisions. The payers may have technical knowledge, but they may not. And they may not have an understanding of what it is like to go through to be a patient with small cell lung cancer and the like. So what they lean on are health technology assessment processes. So health technology assessment, when we use the term broadly, is meant to mean a process that aids healthcare decision-making about technology. And technology can be a really broad thing. We could mean commercial drugs or tests, but we could also mean how we organize care or how we pay for care. It could mean healthcare information technology. It could mean processes, procedures of care, vaccines, and the like. Typically, we mean anything any intervention that might impact a person's health. And there are many different definitions that have been proposed for health technology assessment. I tend to like these two, just because they are definitions, and we'll get into that. There is though consensus definition, which I've written about, saying that maybe it's lacking. We won't get into that right now. So ultimately, it doesn't matter what we call it, health technology assessment is intended to be a process that is policy oriented. It's helping healthcare systems achieve their goals. And remember, the healthcare systems are serving patients. They're also trying to serve care providers. So there are multiple goals. Because new technology can have multiple impacts across multiple stakeholders, and has those different impacts require different approaches to estimate impact. We're usually talking about a process that requires analysis across different disciplines. It's not just about looking at medical information. It could be looking at economic information. We may be considering qualitative information about how patients experience disease and the like. But the takeaway here is it's a policy tool. HTA is something that policymakers use to help them inform policy priorities. Sometimes HTA is meant to, some people use it simultaneously to mean a report. It's not a report. It's not a method. There's no method of HTA. HTA uses a variety of methods. And if people are curious, HTA came from a bunch of different places. Typically in Canada, the processes that we see have been adopted by hospital pharmacists. A lot of payers in Canada are actually hospital pharmacists who've gone into either a public insurance role or in the cancer system, formulary management of the broader cancer system. But health technology assessment also is born out of a discipline called technology assessment, which was nothing to do with health, looking at large impact technologies that could impact society. It's also borrowing from this idea of biomedical engineering, which is something that hospitals use to look at how they should manage medical technology, testing things in practice to ensure that the usability and positive impact. And we even see health technology assessment borrowing concepts from regulators who talk about a life cycle approach to manage technology. So it's an amalgam of things, and some people will be surprised if they come from one discipline to understand that it's been informed by other disciplines. I've done a lot of work in health technology assessment over the years, and this is a map of what we consider best practices, the kinds of questions that health technology assessments need to ask themselves in order to create good processes of technology assessment, all the way from how they define their HTA process to how do they make sure that it makes a positive impact. So there are recognized international standards of good practice. There's no single method, but there are things that we think improve the legitimacy of an HTA process. So that process, again, borrows from the best approaches from the underlying disciplines. Since health is a primary concern, we use epidemiology and biostatistics, all the things that had to do with that precision medicine question. to tease out what's going on with a new technology, what is the impact possibly. But we also are concerned about costs. And so we might borrow from health economics. We may be concerned about equity and social justice. We may have to borrow from philosophy, biomedical ethics. We may be concerned about legal implications. And so that requires legal analysis done according to its methods. All analysis, all evaluation requires judgments and interpretation. And these things are complicated. And so, I'm often reviewing dossiers both by CADTH and INS, and occasionally you will see technical mistakes or interpretations that could be made a different way. At the end of the day, it's like having a jury. In the legal system, we recognize that they may not always make the right decision, but we want to set it up in such a way that it's very likely to make good decisions and not very likely to make poor ones. And again, we're using this approach to help payers make good decisions, because without it, then we're left to potentially alternatives that are not as good. So that's my opening to HTA. And now here's my kind of subjective, my take on some of the challenges that we see in HTA. And I've broken this down into what I think are more real challenges, and probably things you don't hear about as much. And then what I see is sort of fake challenges, things you hear about a lot, but aren't really that big of a challenge for HTA. And I'm going to talk about the real challenges and the ones that overlap with the fake challenges. I've said the real challenges are the ones that are on fire, and the fake ones are just a bunch of smoke. We can talk about any of these at the end, but I'm going to focus on the ones I think are really important and the ones that will kind of advance and help HTA innovate in coming years. And some of these are being dealt with, and I'll try to point out where they are. I'll try not to be too technical. I think some of these things are straightforward. So oops, sorry. As I said, I'm going to stick with this where the red circle is for now, so that I'll talk about a lot of these things. The biggest single challenge, I think, for HTA is actually communication. Language and meaning are very important. And when we're talking about these sensitive issues of life and death, we have to be very careful. I mean, from the get-go, I did mention I have a favorite HTA definition. The current HTA definition that's been sort of agreed upon internationally is not really a definition, and that creates me real pause for thought. If you have ill-defined language from the get-go, that means that we can get into a situation where we're talking about how to improve something, but we don't even agree as to what that something is. So I think we have to be careful about jargon. We see it even within HTA in Canada. For example, we have seen publications about key principles in HTA, but when we look at it, there's more values than principles. We see the words patients and public and consumers being used interchangeably. But I think if you're a patient, you don't really think you're part of the public. You are part of the public, but you don't really want those things to be interchangeable. And the word consumers has a specific meaning. And so we still see a kind of conflation of these concepts, which I think is really important. We hear things like real world data and real world evidence. And the word evidence, CADTH, if you go to the CADTH website, they'll say, what does the evidence say? I don't think evidence says anything. I think people interpret information according to how they want to interpret it, or everybody has an idea, and whether something is proof positive or evidence of anything is a matter of interpretation. So evidence doesn't say things, people say things about information. And there are similar challenges with word value. It means a lot of things. In economic terms, it means what you're willing to give up to get something. But it also means other things in other disciplines and areas, so we have to be careful with the use of it. The word cost is often misunderstood. Even the word evaluation or appraisal is a term that's used in the UK quite a bit. Rare, what do we mean by rare? And precision medicine, what do we mean by that? So I'm not a big fan of jargon. I think, you know, if you start with a fuzzy concept, you end up with a fuzzy conclusion. And so I'm a big fan of what do you mean? And I don't mind using these terms, but I think they have to be defined when we do use them. In cancer, it gets even a little dicier. We often see these types of survival analysis curves, and we often will see, even within HTA appraisals, language to the effect of, you know, the number needed to treat to save a life, or, you know, that lives were saved, when in fact these curves really often just show us that your life has been extended, or you have a chance of your life being extended, not being saved. There are therapies that in theory could end up curing your cancer, but even the word cure is subject to interpretation. And, you know, I attend a lot of meetings where there's debates about whether we mean no disease after 3 years, no disease after 5 years. And those types of endpoints are used to mean cure because physicians know there's a very low chance your cancer will come back, but they're not saying it won't come back. So is that a cure? It's a really important thing to discuss. What do we mean? Cancer is often predicated on the use of these types of curves and the use of things called hazard ratios. And these are very difficult to interpret properly, and you see misinterpretation of them all the time. You also see, even in CADTH assessments, the idea of maintaining survival or the idea of treatment waning. And these concepts are often misused, which have implications for how we think about the value of drugs, for example. Often these curves are actually statistical models. They're not what we see, they're estimates, but they're often sort of discussed as being real. And so we have to be careful about, do we mean an estimate of something, or do we mean what we really saw? And then there's the term precision medicine. Sometimes that's meant to mean using a therapy along with a genetic test, but there are situations where the genetic information is not as informative as other things. So a person who has non-small cell lung cancer, knowing how much a person has smoked, or knowing what their ancestry is, can be actually much more important for understanding how well a drug might work than genetic information. So is knowing how much you've smoked precision medicine? Well, it is. I mean, the physician's making choices based on the best available information and information to help tailor to you. But it doesn't require fancy tests always. It just requires a proper workup of your history. So we have to be careful, I think, when we use language, because we can then overstep, or we can misinterpret, or we can get into debates that we shouldn't be getting into because we're not communicating properly. So there's no real specific solutions here. Obviously, when you use terms, they should be defined. And if we corrupt our language, we're going to end up with challenges. And so I think one thing that patients can do is ask, what do you mean? And then what we can do of HTA bodies is ask for and demand definitions, real definitions that actually define things. We can try to encourage people from eliminating jargon or convenience terms, influential words. And if I say real world evidence, that can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. So it's not helpful if I say real world evidence. I need to tell you exactly what I'm talking about. And scientists are not communications experts, far from it. So, we should be relying on organizations that are deliberating on and reporting on the findings or their interpretation or their recommendations, to using clear language and language specialists when they're doing these types of things. And we should, as I said, demand standards and not just from HTA bodies, but from all health organizations that affect patients. This next one's a bit of a, well, I think it's important. I'm going to go down a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's the concept of uncertainty, which you've probably all heard of before. You've heard HTA bodies say, we are uncertain. And the main problem I have with this is actually just an extension of problem one. It's ill-defined. There are different types of uncertainty. And what you see is HTA organizations kind of using these different types interchangeably. And I don't want to get into it, but there's the uncertainty we have, like when we flip a coin, we're uncertain if it's going to go heads or tails. We know with certainty it's about 50% chance one or the other. But there's also the uncertainty we have when we don't even know what could happen. For example, when we're uncertain, if we know a drug actually creates a response in a patient, but we don't know if it's going to extend their life or save their life, lead to a cure, that's a different kind of uncertainty. We often see in these technical documents things like p-values that are used, and that's supposed to somehow describe uncertainty, but p-values, for a whole variety of reasons, and that's a whole different webinar, are a really poor substitute for describing how uncertain we are about something. We do use other types of statistical approaches. There's an approach called Bayesian approaches, and they're used in the economic models. They can be helpful, but they're often misinterpreted. I've just drawn an example of the kind of uncertainty, the bigger kind of uncertainty that decision makers face all the time, from a statistician named Peter Wally, who said, think about this, I have in front of me a closed bag, has colored marbles. What's the probability I'll draw a red marble? He's not telling you how many red marbles there are or non-red marbles. He's just asking the question. That's a whole different type of uncertainty than, knowing there's 30 red marbles and 70 black ones. But we see it in HTA, and we see it because of the way that some trials are designed, often with an intent to get a positive regulatory decision. Regulators are making decisions that are different from HTA bodies or the payers that they support. And this creates real challenges. So, here's a very recent example of poly-V for large B-cell lymphoma. And look, and this can really seem counterintuitive to some people. It says a clinical trial showed there were 6.6% more patients that were alive without their disease 2 years after treatment. Well, that sounds good to me. But then it goes on to say, however, there's uncertainty whether this difference translates to a meaningful difference in the real world. Well, what do you mean? Well, what they mean is the trial didn't really reflect real world conditions. What they don't go on to say, of course, is, well, how much do those conditions affect certainty? Or what kind of trial do they need? It's more of a subjective interpretation. I just don't feel that the evidence that's given to me provides compelling proof. But you see how gray it is, and making sure that we're clear about how we arrive at this uncertainty is probably an important thing. I mean, one approach is just to say, well, we need to trust that a group of experts are uncertain, that this 6.6%, which translates to like 1 in every 15 patients, is actually highly uncertain. But can we explain that uncertainty a bit better? Can we help people understand why and what would need to change. And there are approaches and techniques used to be able to better justify conclusions about uncertainty, but those are not widely used by HTA bodies. What can end up also happening is CADTH or another HTA body like INES might just say, it's too much uncertainty, not going to fund. And this is why we've seen lately this move towards time-limited recommendations, which is one attempt to recognizing that sometimes evidence comes early, sometimes we're uncertain. Traditionally, we would have said no. Now we'll say yes, but we're going to say yes provided more information comes later on. That's at least one attempt to deal with uncertainty, but it's a very blunt attempt. And there might be other ways. So what other solutions? I mean, the biggest solution to all of this is just having a very good process, a legitimate process that has standards for how do we consider uncertainty with good deliberation, which I'm going to get into. We have enough people weighing in and standards to guide us. That's one way. Then we get into the situation of like the jury, where the jury still could be wrong, but at least they have a lot of guidance and they're representative of a broad range of views, and so we can come up with something. There are also, as I said, technical solutions, and I don't want to get into all of these. One of the ones that's been around for a very long time is something called quantitative bias analysis. You will often see in an HTA report, we think this is biased, and sometimes they're not using the language correctly, but when they are, they don't tell you, well, how much is each factor contributing to bias, or you know, how much is the trial imbalanced? They might say the trial is imbalanced, it's leading to bias, but they don't give us information about just how imbalanced the trial is. And so there are ways to further unpack this kind of uncertainty. There was a global policy forum. It's called the HTA policy forum. This is the International Society of HTA organization, or HTA people interested in HTA, individual people, including with lots of participation from HTA organizations like CADTH, where they all got together and talked about this, but they didn't really get to some strong conclusions about how to deal with uncertainty. So it still remains a substantive challenge. A third challenge, I would say, is collaboration. We do know in Canada, we do actually have in Canada different HTA organizations. For example, INES and CADTH, we've seen them in situations where they're dealing with a drug that is very uncertain. Not surprisingly, one say yes and one say no, and it's not consistent who will say yes and who will say no. But you know, one of the things that's quite clear is if we're trying to deliver care equitably, we have multinational pharmaceutical companies. One of the ways that we could potentially not only be equitable within our country, but even across countries, is collaborating, setting up international standards to deal with you know, these larger companies. Otherwise, each country on its own is not really going to have enough clout. And we're seeing this happen now. We're seeing just as recently as March 27th, information about the European Union and the European Commission launching public consultation on joint clinical assessments in HTA. CADTH has also been, for quite a long time now, collaborating with the regulator, try to make sure that there is coordination, including parallel review. And CADTH more recently, in fall of 2022, announced collaboration with a bunch of other HTA organizations looking at standards, and both interpretive standards, and they have some other joint projects. And you can just search for this headline and you'll see the kinds of things they're working on. And this is good news because together they're going to be stronger than each could do individually. Creating standards takes work, but it means that they can be consensus definitions, and there can be work done that could be quite meaningful. So I think collaboration is terribly important. I think also, obviously, CADTH and other HTA organizations could collaborate with folks, organizations that are not HTA bodies as well. And I think CADTH recently has shown a lot of openness to wanting to do that, more of that kind of collaborative work. Okay, related to this is engagement and deliberation. Obviously, you can't really collaborate if you don't engage and deliberate, but this is quite a hobby horse of mine. I think people tend to focus on technical things, especially when you ask scientists what's important. They'll say, well, it's technical things. They focus on the way they've done reviews and conflicts of interest and interpretation of facts. But interpretation of facts are only one, so you can get all of that right, but you have to have a process that ultimately is legitimate. And so if we focus too much on just technical standards, we're going to miss the point. We have to think about how is information considered, and how is it discussed, and how is it deliberated upon, how are viewpoints exchanged, and what values are present. And this values question is really important. When I do my HTA 101 course every year, we talk about the fact that there are facts and, of course, interpretations of facts, but there are also values. And I run this poll, and don't be offended, but the poll is meant to be controversial. I say, with COVID, I'm going to have to come up with something new now because COVID's sort of in the background. There were facts that were presented that men were dying and hospitalized at up to twice the rate of women. And this was particularly true of middle-aged men. So my proposal was that we could invest in man clinics intended to help middle-aged men and get them back to work. And if we invested $20 million, we could produce 3 additional qualities for every 1,000 men that went to the man clinic. We'll get these men back to work. And I ask people every year to vote on whether, for $20 million, would they rather invest in these man clinics, or would they prefer to instead take the $20 million to enhance a newborn screening program. And same $20 million is produce the same amount of health, reduce hospitalization by the same amount. So technically, these things are identical, except, of course, instead of getting men back to work, we'll have more mouths to feed, so it'll cost more, ultimately. What do you vote? And of course, the votes come in, and every year, lo and behold, the man clinics does not win. The newborn screening program goes ahead, and that's because of our social values. We value the health of children more than we value the health of middle-aged men, much to my chagrin. So, but that's okay. That's societal value. Of course we do. So if we had to make decisions and we only have $20 million to spend, we may only invest in the newborn screening program. Values are important. Social values are important. How do we get at social values? Well, we don't ask just bureaucrats, or we don't ask doctors. They're not representative of everybody's society. We need to have a good process for doing that. And that means that we need to have a process of engagement and deliberation, a good process of engagement and deliberation. Until recently, there haven't really been any standards or good practices for engagement and deliberation in healthcare, in HTA, although there have been standards outside of HTA. Obviously, we think about the legal system having wonderful standards for deliberation and exchange and discussing what information is allowable and admissible when we're making important decisions that affect the welfare of people. So we want to borrow from these political processes, these processes of deliberative democracy. And so we need standards for how we do deliberation. And unfortunately, as you know, to date, HTA processes have kind of been often developed by, folks like hospital pharmacists who understand deliberation from P&T committees, but they may not have a deeper understanding of the need for broad exchange and deliberation. However, HTA bodies are catching up with this idea. So Quebec has had a very progressive standard for deliberation for some time, and CADTH is actually currently developing new standards and a new deliberative framework, which we are going to hear about shortly, but for now is sort of being looked at internally. So I think we should see more here, but this is really a real important thing. I mean, how can we have a discussion? How can we weigh in on the importance of an outcome or what have you, unless we're engaging, everybody who needs to be engaged and having an exchange? And unfortunately, in Canada, we also have an environment of not exchange, but consultation, not deliberation. We are planning to do this. Tell us what you think. Write us a letter. And we see that across a lot of government. Probably a bit antiquated. I think we need to probably move forward and actually, invite people into the room. The fifth challenge and potential solution in Canada, I think, is timeliness. And I think this one gets misunderstood. I'm throwing it out there. This isn't strictly an HTA challenge. But the first thing about timeliness that we have to be careful about when we're talking about the time for a drug to get to a patient, I mean, first of all, I think we can all agree that if there is a very valuable drug out there, nobody wants to be sort of waiting for this drug, particularly if you have cancer and it's a life-threatening situation. We want to get to it. And so what we will hear from some, this is a slide I got from the Industry Association website, where they're trying to highlight that Canada is very slow from number of days from the first launch to public reimbursement. Well, that's one way of looking at it. They did choose like a broad swath of years. But if we look at it in a different way, and this is, this is a more recent document from the Center for Innovative Regulatory Science, you can see some of what's going on. One of the things that's going on is we may have regulatory approval, and then we may have a gap before things are actually, before a company chooses to apply. So some of these days is actually maybe attributed to the internal processes of companies and their ability to actually apply. We do have a parallel review process in Canada that allows companies to apply up to 6 months ahead of, and we've had this for a number of years, ahead of a regulatory approval. And it works well. You can see it actually shores up time, except that it's only been used by about 50% of companies to date. And so as a result, there's been a recent initiative by CADTH and the regulator to look at, well, why has it been only taken up 50% of the time? So not all of the delay in terms of the review time has to do with CADTH or the regulator, who are keeping pretty consistent times. But how are we doing against the rest of the world? Well, I mean, here's another way of looking at it. In the last few years, you can see there are countries that are faster, like Australia, but there are also countries that are a bit slower, like England. And so it depends on who you're comparing to, it depends on how you're measuring it. But after all of this, this is still not time to patient. We still have this negotiation. For cancer, PCPA, who's negotiating on behalf of all the provinces, takes around an average of about 75 days to negotiate. So that's on top of all of this, which could be avoided if we had parallel reviews. And of course, that timeliness can have to do with the need and the urgency, the complexity of the file. It also has to do with how companies are organized. And so there are company related factors also to negotiation. It's not all about payers sort of sitting there delaying. There's a bunch of things. It's a very complex process, and I don't think we can point the finger squarely at anyone. But what it does tell us is, if we really want to get timely access, this isn't just about the CADTH times, which are not too bad. This is about increasing this parallel review process, having the regulator and CADTH working together, which means we have to figure out how to do that in a meaningful way, which is something they're looking into. But it's also about somehow reducing the PCPA times. Now, PCPA has undergone some change in how they're organized, and they're now open to looking at how they might be able to improve things, and they have actually taken steps to improve some review times. So, we'll see what happens. So I've touched on some of these things: communication and language, collaboration, engagement, timeliness. I have not touched on other things. I'm willing for people to pipe up and say, why aren't those real challenges? I don't think they, rare. I don't know that rare is something that is going to be seen much differently from non-rare, but that remains to be seen. I don't think real world evidence and data are really a challenge. And I think the only challenge has been that we haven't had frameworks that talk about how we're going to interpret them, but those are forthcoming. This is a whole, some people say, well, if we change the way we value things, things would be different. We can talk about that if you'd wish. And we can talk about the use of cost effectiveness thresholds, which is both, I could have shifted that a little further over. It's both a real and a fake challenge, depending on what the problem is you're spelling out. So I'm willing to talk about any of these things. And I'll leave it there. We're 45 minutes in. I think I'll pass it back to Trevor, who can help moderate our discussion.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that. It was very much an eye-opener, and just kind of the issues that are going around this. And if you have any questions around here, just put it into the questions tab below. My first question actually might be an obvious one to answer, but all of these sort of these terms about, we've talked about this actually at length, that sometimes a term for something that's coming up might not be the most accurate. But why do these terms kind of still, like for instance, real world data and stuff, why do these terms continue to be used and in these spaces whenever they're kind of not exactly describing exactly what you what they are?
Well, I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist, but I think there's two things. One, when we use fuzzy terms, it allows people to, sometimes it allows them, then it gives them more leeway in terms of the kinds of things they want to say. Sometimes they're just shortcuts. Real world evidence is just meant to be, ultimately, or what it was originally intended was, well, stuff that's outside of clinical trials. But, for some people that meant studies of drugs that look at effectiveness and safety that are doing the same thing as a clinical trial, but are not a clinical trial. But for other people, that was, well, not just that. That's also, what if we're looking at the utilization of a drug, or what if we're looking at patient preferences for things? Is that real world evidence? That's outside of a clinical trial. So it's a convenience term. I do understand why we use jargon, but I guess what I'm saying is we have to be careful. I'm a big fan of saying real world data. I think real world evidence is about ultimately what you believe of the data. And so, but there are other arguments to say, well, no, real world evidence just means data. So yeah, why? I think because we want to have conversations, and we have these complex topics, and we want to have a meaningful conversation, so we just shortcut to a term, but it can get us into trouble.
Okay, so Miranda has a bit of a scenario that she would kind of want your input on. So she says, I appreciate how uncertain the evidence can be in terms of overall survival benefit for a person with cancer. Experience on the ground has shown me that people with cancer benefit greatly in terms of their quality of life, if not their quantity of life, from the hope assigned to trying a treatment versus doing nothing, as long as there are not horrible side effects attached to the drugs. We are not gatekeepers of what benefit means to a person with cancer. Although I respect the need to balance this with the economic burden, I want to know how the HTA process handles this scenario if it's ever taken into consideration in decision making.
Well, I mean, they do. I mean, when CADTH looks at any cancer drug, for example, they actually define all the kinds of things they think might be important. And typically for a solid tumor, for example, you know, your length of life, your quality of life, and whether or not you're progressing to other therapies or whether or not your tumors progress, those are things that are usually in the top 3. Then there's the challenge. Well, what do you mean by quality of life? And so what if we had a situation where on average, we use an instrument to measure people's quality of life in a trial, and on average, things don't change much? Well, you know, the typical response from CADTH is that's okay. I mean, we didn't see that on average people worsened their quality of life. But underneath those averages, and this is one of the challenges we have with statistics, is it doesn't matter that on average things didn't change. It might have been very, very beneficial for very few people. You might have seen these real serious gains, and that's sort of diluted by the fact that for most people, things didn't change. Well, that's different. I mean, now we're talking about the fact that some people could really benefit. And the same thing could go for survival and other things. I mean, we can talk about averages, but what does that matter if we actually have a few people who otherwise, you know, who really, really had a survival extension who otherwise would never have had one? So you get into this tricky business of it's not just about the average, it's about the distribution of measurements, about what did we use to measure. So I think it starts with what's important. I think we have to really, really make sure people understand what's important. But then we get this trickiness of how do we measure, and then what do we do with those measurements? But that's what HTA is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be sorting all of that out so that we can tease out whether nothing's going on or something's going on. I don't know if that answers the question. I just think, you know, I don't think these things are being ignored by HTA bodies, but it's possible they could do more.
And I find that actually one of the things that coming up quite a bunch is common sense oncology, and that almost seems to tie into Miranda's comment, where it's that, you know, the benefits of what these drugs, whenever they get this kind of the quality versus quantity of life, as she says, and that's what some people touch on whenever they talk about common sense oncology, to have that kind of conversation. But some people believe also that it's too oncologist focused and not patient focused.
Yeah, well, right. And I mean, ultimately it should be patient focused, right? That's what we need. So then there's a question of, I think the common sense oncology thing touches on the idea that it sort of touches on this idea that if patients knew, if only they knew, they might choose differently. But and we all have different preferences, and that's a challenge again. So we have public policymakers trying to make decisions based on overarching averages and overarching population statistics. But underneath the hood, individuals all have different preferences. Some people would pay anything for 2 more weeks of extending their life. Some people wouldn't bother. They, you know, really look at palliative care and or what have you. We have a range, and so it comes down to, can we make like very blunt population decisions, or are there ways of nuancing it a bit further? Certainly with common sense oncology, I would hope that the starting point is, well, let's just present patients with the facts and see what they'd like to do, as opposed to maybe there is a culture of, you know, heroic treatment, and we never talk about death, and we're just going to do everything we can. I think maybe it's just a response to that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Nancy has a couple of questions. First, do you think that each different disease area should have a bespoke process?
Well, then there's a question of, do we privilege diseases by having processes that might lead to inequitable decisions? I think each disease area is going to require, it could have the same process, but it might require different inputs into that process, or different people involved, or different what have yous. It's, at the end of the day, I think that's a deliberative question. I mean, that's a matter of people sitting down and deciding whether or not we should have, privileged areas. I mean, we already do, in the sense that we do have a different process for cancer recommendations as we do for non-cancer recommendations. And there are people who think that's a little bit unfair. Why would we privilege one over the other? And now we're talking about the rare disease strategy. Should we have another process for rare? What about rare cancer? Is it a rare or is it a cancer? So, I don't know. I think society would probably tell you most diseases are sort of on equal footing. We kind of would privilege diseases that create an undue amount of, shorten life terribly. Diseases in children are terribly important. But those are conversations we have to have. So when we're designing any process, we have to start with open, fulsome deliberation between, affected stakeholders and the ones that are developing these processes.
Nancy asks again, what is the benefit of Canada having two HTA bodies that come up with different decisions? Should we advocate for one, or it solves that each body has different things it values?
Once you have two, you get into a situation of potential inequity. And there are some situations that are very interesting where, as I said, CADTH said yes, and then INS said no, and then subsequently CADTH said no, and INS said yes. And people think, well, they don't know what they're doing. Well, it's not that they don't know what they're doing. There was so much uncertainty in and around those recommendations, and INS does consider slightly different things, that you could have different, opposing. But what does that amount to? Well, it amounts to the fact that if I'm in Quebec, I may have access to a drug, and if I live across the river in Ottawa, I don't. That might be perceived as unfair by some. And so we do have to balance, this. I think on the whole, society might say, we don't really want to live in a postal code lottery world. That then speaks to maybe having more singular processes, so that we're not living in a postal code lottery world. It seems right to me, but then again, I'm not everybody. So, I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Right. Aaron asks, can you comment more on the parallel review process? Do certain conditions have to be met, such as high likelihood of the drug being approved by the regulator, in order for the parallel review process to be initiated?
Well, that's a good bloody question. I don't pretend to be an expert on this aligned review process. I thought it was open. I thought it was wide open, but I stand to be corrected. I don't know that it is wide open, but I thought it was sort of wide open to anybody and anything. I didn't think it necessarily had to do with priority, but somebody could correct me, and I do apologize if I'm misrepresenting.
Alrighty,
there is information about the aligned review. If you look at aligned review process, Health Canada, you can find what the criteria are, but I didn't think anything was off the table.
All right, I do believe that's it for questions. So Don, thank you very much for this talk. It's been a fantastic talk, and we are going to have you back in a couple of months to have more on topics such as this. So thank you very much for your time, and I definitely hope that that a lot of people come away with this and thinking and seeing that that there's different ways of doing this.
Thanks for having me. And if people have any follow-on questions or concerns, they can always text me or email me. I'm happy to receive comments, questions, and thank you so much for attending and having me here.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is one in a series of webinars that we are putting on for this year. Our next one is happening in 2 weeks. We have Dr. Rob Rutledge back with us, and you can get on the registration list right now by going to survivornet.ca/webinars and the upcoming webinar page. You can also check that out. We're going to be sending out an e-blast shortly with the new information for Dr. Rutledge's new talks. So if you prefer to go that way, you can register that way. Now, if you're not seeing your email, our email's in our inbox, check your spam folder because we do use a third-party email service, and make sure that you are subscribed to our newsletter on our website to not miss anything that we're doing here at CCSN. Once again, all webinars can be found at survivornet/webinar or on CCSN's YouTube channel. And so with that, I hope you guys have a fantastic evening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.